So for the structure today, we will be having 4 speakers, and they will each present their presentation in turn, and then that will be followed by the question and answers. So just to introduce you all a little bit to SCANZ, for those who aren't familiar with SCANZ. SCANZ is short for the Science Communications Association of New Zealand. It's a network of people who tell stories about scientific topics, where we hold regular events for people who are keen to hone their storytelling skills and connect with other professionals. And you can find out lots more about us on our website. So in this session today, during the question and answers, if you have a patai or a question, please can you put it into the chat box, and Georgia Carson, who's helping me out today, she will be collating them for me to ask the speakers at the end. As you will have noticed, we're recording this session to enable people to watch it after the fact. So first of all, I will just briefly introduce each of our speakers. First up, we will be having Yin Hsien Fung, who will be communicating, his title is Communicating Mundane Science, the Measurement System and the New Kilogram. Yin Hsien Fung, or people usually call him Fung, is a research assistant for the Mass and Related Quantities team at the Measurement Standards Laboratory of New Zealand, or MSL for short. He started his strong passion for science communication and outreach since his study years at University of Otago, and has continued to maintain his passion, which has seen him communicating science from primary school kids to government ministers. And he's always been experimenting with different presentation styles and perspectives. Following Fung, we will be having a presentation from Alex Beattie on Messenger, Inquisitor or Newsgatherer, the role of the press gallery journalists during COVID-19 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Alex is a postdoctoral fellow, research fellow at the Centre for Society and Society Te Haranga Waka, the Victoria University of Wellington. And his research focuses on the science-media interface. And the current projects include the role of media, government communication, and the Science Media Centre in a crisis. For his PhD, he examined technological ways to disconnect from the internet. Following Alex, we will have Alex Lake-Hammond. Alice will be presenting a presentation on we can't predict earthquakes, but we can prepare for them. So Alice is a designer specializing in the communication of complex information, with a particular interest in how communication design and co-design can help us prepare for and respond to emergency events. She's the program lead for AF8, which is the Alpine Fault Magnitude 8. She's a program of scientific modeling, response planning, and community engagement aimed at building collective resilience across the South Island for the next Alpine Fault earthquake. A key activity of the program is the AF8 Roadshow, The Science Beneath Our Feet, which shares Alpine Fault hazard risk science with communities likely to be impacted by an AF8 earthquake to enable informed decision-making and increased preparedness. And lastly, we'll have Charlotte Šunde, who will be presenting on weaving lake knowledges through digital storytelling. Charlotte is a social scientist at the Cawthorne Institute in Nelson. Her work involves documenting cultural and social values, histories and relationships with New Zealand's lakes, freshwater fish species, and open ocean aquaculture in partnership with iwi. Charlotte has been involved in art science projects here and overseas over the past 15 years and brings creative storytelling methods into her scientific research projects. Her presentation today will reflect on her experiences in the Lakes 380 project and production of a series of documentaries for the lakestoriesnz.org website. So just a reminder to put your questions into the chat box, and that that you'll all be on mute throughout for simplicity. So kia te mata tatou. So let's start with speaker number 1. So ko Yin Hsien Fung with his presentation on communicating mundane science, the measurement system, and the new kilogram. So over to you, Fung.
Thank you, Emma. I'll just share my screen first. Is that there? Yep. Okay. All right. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for the introduction, Emma. Actually, this is my first SCANZ conference, so I don't know what to expect really. So let's see how this goes, shall we? Mundane, according to the Collins dictionary, is an adjective which is defined as everyday, ordinary, or banal, and also relating to the world or worldly matters. Now, what do I mean by mundane science? It is not the kind of science that is perceived as cutting edge, like quantum physics or biotechnology. It does not relate to trendy issues like COVID or climate change. It does not produce pretty images like space physics or marine science. It is not a hot topic like renewable energy or artificial intelligence. It is not a cool topic either, like sea ice physics or cold atoms. It is not a subject that people usually wonder, like, are we going to cure cancer or are we alone in the universe? It does not have problems that public can relate to, like earthquakes and water quality. So what is it actually? It is the kind of science that has been well established and has been working behind the scenes, quietly away from the limelight. It is the kind of science where its applications are everywhere. We use it every day, every minute, and even every second. It enables the society to operate, to trade, to build, and yes, to do science. However, it still has its own problems to solve, and it does need to constantly improve for the advancement of technology. Finding solutions to these problems does not require less research, but the support and knowledge for it can be weak relative to their importance to human and society. Yes, it is important. It is probably the most important science that you have never heard of, but it has always been there. Just like your washing machine at home, it has always been there in your life. You need it in your life. You know it just works, but you won't brag about it. Even if you want to brag about it and explain how it works, no one will seem to be interested to hear about it. So what is this mundane science that I'm on about? It is called metrology, not meteorology, which is something to do with weather. Metrology is the science of measurements and its application. This branch of science started since the metric system was introduced after the French Revolution in the 19th century. Metrology is responsible for the international measurement system. Metrology improves the measurements that we use in terms of accuracy, precision, and efficiency. In fact, almost every country has a national metrology institute to look after and improve the measurement systems. In New Zealand, it is the Measurement Standards Laboratory, located at Lower Hutt, just before going over the Wainui Hills. Why do we need all this, you may ask? Let's start with a question. Where do measurements come from? And then another question. How do we know the measurements that we made are correct? Perhaps we have taken the answers to these questions for granted. After all, things are getting digitalized. Measurements are very easy to make. We just need to point the device to something you want to measure and then read the numbers of devices. And that makes us less likely to question the validity and the origin of our measurements. Let's take mass or weighing as an example. Now, you have a block of cheese at a supermarket. How do you know it weighs 1 kilogram? Some people say you read it off the product label, fair enough. But if you want to make sure it is really 1 kilogram, then you put it on a supermarket scale. Now, how do you know the supermarket scale is correct? There is this thing called the trade weight standards. You put it on the scale to check if the scale is showing the correct weight. How do you know then this trade weight standards is correct? You compare it with a higher accuracy weight standard. And then you can compare this with even better weights. Eventually, you can compare these high accuracy weights with the New Zealand primary kilograms, which are maintained at where I work, the Measurement Standards Lab. That's not the end though, as we still need to compare it against the international kilogram, which almost all countries do. All these weights are used to check the weighing scales with varying degree of accuracy that are required in different aspects in society and industries. For example, in supermarkets, at petrol stations, for construction sites, aviation, weather forecasts, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and research labs. Now, there was just the weight or mass measurements or papatipu in Tireo. This also applies to other measurements that surrounds you and your life, like length, roa, time, wa, electrical current, yahiko, temperature, pamahana, amount of chemical substance, rahingamatu, and light intensity, kuku fakaputa turama. So, how do I communicate my mundane science and research? Here is how it goes. The kilogram has just been redefined in 2019. Before this, over the past 130 years, the kilogram was defined as a lump of metal kept in a vault in Paris. However, scientists have found out that the mass of this lump of metal is changing over time, which means the kilogram itself is unstable, and that is unacceptable. That's why the global scientific community had come together and agreed on a new definition for kilogram that is based on an unchanging fundamental constant in nature called the Planck's constant. Someone has even tattooed it on his arm. While the redefinition itself will have no impact on how we weigh apples or grapes at the supermarket, it is important to enable new technologies and for industries such as pharmaceuticals and microelectronics, where precise and accurate measurements are crucial. Now, to link the Planck's constant with the kilogram, we can build a machine called the kibble balance. This is how a kibble balance looks like, and this is the kibble balance at the United States. Here in Lower Hutt, we are building a unique QE version of it that is desktop size, simpler, and cost-effective while being fit for purpose. Once completed, it will be one of its kind and be the 10th kibble balance in the world. So that took under 2 minutes to deliver. If you think that my mundane science is, after all, not so mundane anymore, then perhaps I have achieved my goal for today. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I would appreciate any feedbacks. Cheers.
Ngā Fung, if you can stop your screen sharing.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, ngā mihi.
That's good. Cool. Cool. Kia ora. Thank you. Next up, we will have Alice Lake-Hammond. Alex Beattie. Sorry, Alex. Next up, we will have Alex. If you would like to share your screen. Alex will be talking about Messenger, Inquisitor, or Newsgatherer, the role of press gallery journalists during COVID-19 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yep. Yep.
Right. This is also my first SCANZ conference, and if every talk is as good as Fung's, the last one, then I will definitely be coming back. So that was a fantastic talk. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about my research. My background is in media studies. I study the media, but I've been working at the Centre for Science and Society for the past year, looking at science and media relations. And my talk today is looking at the perception of the role of the press gallery during the daily briefings that we were all familiar with, and particularly in March to May last year in the first national-wide lockdown. So I want to start my talk by looking at an IMDb page to really hammer home how popular the daily briefings were. IMDb is a website usually reserved for television shows where people fill information regarding the synopsis, the cast, and really show their fandom about their favorite show. And you might be aware that this was done for the 1 p.m. daily updates because people love them. We really appreciated the Prime Minister and Dr. Brimfield and the kind of communication that they did during a very anxious time. And you can see here on the website that there's episode guides, there's a synopsis, very glowing review of the 1 p.m. updates. And there's also a cast list. And not only do we have the Prime Minister and Dr. Bloomfield, but also we have roles here reserved for the reporters. Because as we might remember, after the updates, the media would have questions, and then that would be broadcast or live streamed as well. And I really want to draw attention to the role here of the media. They've given a role in the show, and there was an impression that their role was actually as antagonists. They were villains. They were questioning, scrutinizing our beloved Prime Minister and Dr. Bloomfield. Here, there's a couple of tongue-in-cheek, but also, serious comments that some people didn't appreciate the role that reporters like Tova O'Brien from Newshub were performing. And it turns out that journalistic roles is actually a field of research in journalism studies. It's quite a massive area of research. And in fact, journalist scholars talk about various perceived roles that journalists have in society. You have the fourth estate, one of the most important roles, which is holding authority to account, like the government. You have the facilitator role, where the role is more passing on information that the journalist might believe the public should know about. There's the educator role. This is sort of like a science explainer, where the role is to explain complex ideas in an accessible format. There's the civic role, representing the interests of particular groups, and also infotainment, trying to make news engaging. And there's lots of overlap and there's lots more roles. I just wanted to highlight a few. And the reason why it's considered an important area of research is that once you understand how journalists see themselves, if a journalist sees themselves as part of the fourth estate and therefore being critical of power, that's supposed to inform the way they do their job, the kind of questions they ask, the kind of frames that they deploy and the stories that they write, etc. So that was sort of the context of how I approached this study. How did the press gallery see themselves when they were in the 1 p.m. briefings? Did their views differ to the general public's, if at all? And was this one of the reasons that the daily briefings were controversial to some people? And I don't have time to talk about my method, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So one of the primary findings that I had was that the press gallery really saw themselves as the fourth estate. And I should probably say that I interviewed members of the press gallery. I interviewed 14 people. And this was really a key finding. A lot of them really talked about how in a crisis, this part of their job becomes heightened. And so that wasn't really surprising. And I've got here a couple of quotes for you to look at. And I'm sorry, I don't really have time to stop on the slides for too long. Now, this finding contrasts to previous studies. In a study in 2019 that looked at journalists in Germany and Finland during swine flu, they found that actually journalists felt that they were more supposed to be educators and facilitators. So this finding contrasts those, and I can unpack that a little bit. But our press gallery did acknowledge other roles. They didn't just talk about being the fourth estate. They acknowledged that they're also passing on important information about lockdown, that their role was also to educate on what different alert levels meant, but also aspects of the virus, and also to advocate for particular people. So they did talk about those roles, but they were more secondary to being the fourth estate. And then there's a sort of interesting question about, well, was COVID-19 more political than previous pandemics? If you think about some of the political ramifications, border closures, going into lockdown, the restrictions on our everyday freedoms, some of the journalists talked about how they believed, these decisions needed to be justified. They really wanted to push the government to justify these extraordinary actions. And the point is not to undermine them in their view, but to really, force the government to justify them. And they were aware that this was unpopular. One journalist talked about how, we were living in a blitz spirit era, comparing it to the UK during the Second World War, and there was lots of a nationalistic feeling at the time. But they felt quite proud about how their critical questions improved the response. And they pointed to MIQ, the use of masks, and they felt that they were part of the team of 5 million, but perhaps weren't recognised for that. In contrast, the public saw the primary role of the media as being a facilitator, and I drew upon some interviews that some of my colleagues took with viewers of the daily briefings. And again, this wasn't just the role they talked about, but it was the primary one. So here you see one reason why there was a bit of controversy about the role of the media. The media saw their primary role to be the fourth estate, be critical, and audiences of the briefings saw the primary responsibility was to pass on information. I'm going to have to go through this really quickly, and I'm sorry. And that's one reason I think that the daily briefings cause a bit of controversy. But there's one more that I want to highlight. And that's that the press gallery, what I learned about in my interviews was they weren't just there to have a role for society or democracy, but there's more of a sort of functional and pragmatic role that the press gallery does, which is just make the news. The press gallery has a long history of being a very place-based type of journalism. At Parliament, they cover political news, they're there for press conferences, they sit outside Parliament, and they described the daily briefings experience as showing the public a little bit how the news sausage is made. And they described that it's typically not a very nice thing to look at. They ask aggressive questions, there's lots of shouting, but it's because it's like that because the Prime Minister and Dr. Bloomfield are very well trained to deflect questions, and they often have to ask questions again to get the sort of answers that they want. And this is part of the way in which the press gallery works. And so their lives didn't change that much. It's just that we were let into their world. And in particular, they talked about, there's a reason why TV will ask the Prime Minister to repeat a question. They want the Prime Minister to look directly at the camera to create that product. Radio wants a soundbite, so they'll again ask for a quote. And even so-called dumb questions. I'm thinking about Jason Walls asking Dr. Bloomfield to comment on Trump's thing around ingesting bleach, or Henry Crooked about 5G and sort of there was complaints that they were sort of, encouraging conspiracy type thinking by asking those questions. And in response, these reporters said, look, we're not trying to validate conspiracy or misinformation, but that the news is actually getting Dr. Bloomfield or the Prime Minister to respond. That's the news product. And so what you're seeing here is us making the news, not news itself. And the public, in contrast, were just really annoyed with the journalist questions. So again, there's a reason here that this potentially caused controversy. And just to sort of finish on this point, I just want to draw your attention to this last quote from one of the journalists. And I thought they had a really nice way of putting it. Maybe to properly judge the performance of these journalist roles for being critical of the government, for passing on information, maybe we shouldn't judge them for what we saw in the daily briefings, because that's behind the scenes. But maybe we should judge them for what they actually produced, news itself. And just to sort of, again, hammer that point home, if we think about when we judge an actor's performance, like Brie Larson here in Captain Marvel, we don't judge it based on, when they're doing acting in the moment, because there's green screen and it's raw and it has to go through the production process. We judge it once it actually goes through all that movie magic and it becomes the end product. In comparison, should we be judging their performance when they're in the press gallery, when they're in the theaterette, compared to once it goes through all the editors and they actually create the news product? That's perhaps what we should be judging them for. So that's how I'm going to conclude. There are two reasons I think we found the daily briefings to be unsettling. One is we had different, potentially, belief on what they're for, what the journalist's role there is for. The journalists think they're there to be critical. The public generally thinks they're there to facilitate. And the second point is that perhaps their role was presented as news itself, whereas it was more kind of behind the scenes. That's me. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to having any questions. Thank you.
Ngā mihi, Alex. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk and interesting piece of research. Just before we proceed, we'll now proceed to Alice. Alice Lake-Hammond will be presenting on "We Can't Predict Earthquakes, but We Can Prepare for Them." So over to you, Alice.
Great, thank you. Very interesting topics to follow. Awesome. So thanks again for the invitation to come along today and present on this. Some of you may have heard of AF8, some of you may have not. I'm going to present today on one of our communication activities we use when we're talking about a scary thing like a big alpine fault magnitude 8 earthquake. But before I just dive into that, I'm going to give a quick snapshot of what AF8 is all about for those who aren't aware. We're a really collaborative project. It's a recognition essentially that the Alpine Fault is the largest natural hazard in the South Island, and as you can see by that picture on the right there, it reaches into pretty much every region, and when the civil defence groups across those are our 6 civil defence group regions here in the South Island, So looking at this with our science partners, there was a realization this is something we're not tackling alone. This is an event we need to work together on. And so this is really where AF8 came about. The program has three main focuses, essentially. There's the scientific modelling. So we have a really very depth and breadth of support from all our science community around New Zealand working in this space. And our civil defence groups, it's around the response planning side of this. So how do we actually respond to something quite so big? And obviously community engagement is really, really important in here because we can't be planning for one thing and then talking about another. This is something that we all have a part to play in. And so I actually came on board around about the time that we needed to do some community engagement. My role, my background is in design and communications, as Emma said. And when I came on, we started looking at ways to socialise some of the science and some of the issues around response with communities around the South Island to enable them to make informed decisions and be better prepared for this event. And I don't have time to show you the whole AF8 scenario, but this is a pretty good snapshot of the kind of thing we're communicating. So the scenario that we use for the Alpine Fault, there's a number of ways that this event could play out. But what you're looking at here is a south to north rupture scenario, where the epicenter is located at the southern end of that Alpine Fault straight line. You can see it moving up the island. We're a minute in now, and we're not quite halfway. The height of the animation there is representing the peak ground velocity. That's not how high the ground is going to jump in this earthquake, for clarification. Also in that top right corner, you can see the 2D. So we're still moving up the island, and you can see the energy waves moving up across the motu. So this has been a really, really engaging tool for us in terms of communicating what this event could be like. But we're not just communicating the science in this, we're communicating the geological science, we're communicating the hazard risk impact science, and we're communicating preparedness information as well. But we're communicating it as a South Island wide event. It's not an event that's going to happen somewhere else to somebody somewhere else, and we're not going to have to worry about it. It's actually a national event as well. The reason we focus on the South Island is because AF8's scope is limited to the South Island at the moment. So you can see it's quite a significant scenario or story, if you like, that we are presenting to our public. And I'm going to talk you some of the ways that we've been doing this around the island now. So this map here on the right-hand side is the 2D version, shake map of what you just watched on the animation. So it's showing you the MMI intensity scale of the level of shaking that is expected across the island in that south to north rupture scenario. Overlaid on top of that is all the places we've visited over the 2 road shows we have run so far. So we've been pretty much as many places we can get. We tend to focus more on the rural and the remote communities, partly because these communities tend to have less access to that sort of science, or the direct access at least to the science community, and often have a lot of questions, and there's an opportunity to have those answered as part of the roadshow. And also because those are the communities that are likely to be isolated for a period of time and need to know how to look after themselves and what to expect in this event. It is, important to say that we are looking at an inevitable event. For those of you who don't know, the Alpine Fault has a return time about 300 years on average. The last known large event of this kind was around about 1717. So when you do the maths, you start to realise that now is a good time to be talking about it. We target both community talks, which are open to all, and we also have a schools program that we run alongside it. And that's really important because there's a 75% chance that this event will happen in the next 50 years, which is a really, really high chance. And if it doesn't happen in the next 50 years, it's pretty likely to happen in the lifetime of our young people. So this is a conversation we want everybody to be involved in. And that's why we make our community science talks very open. It's first come, best seated, essentially. And those school sessions are paired up at the same time. And they're a really good opportunity for us to reach more of the community. So when we're in a rural community, for example, Murchison with a population of about 400, I might teach about 60 students at the area school during the day, and then we might have about 50 people turn up to a talk in the evening, and that's already 25% of the community that has been invited into the conversation. This is sort of how we frame it. It's not about telling people too much, it's about inviting them into the conversation about how we understand our landscape better, because so we can be more resilient and make better decisions around living in it. And one of the reasons we frame it like that is because actually if we didn't have earthquakes, certainly if we didn't have an alpine fault, we wouldn't really have the South Island as we know it today. And that's one of our key messages as well, in terms of understanding where we live, what that means, and how we can work together to be better prepared for the next earthquake. One of the other reasons we framed this sort of piece of communication under a roadshow is because we need to take the knowledge that we do have about this inevitable event, which is all based on hypotheticals, really, in a scenario. This is just what we expect based on the best of our knowledge. Taking it into that local context is really where it's of most relevance to that community. And it's about enabling those conversations on how to be better prepared. So we usually have a talk for community talks. They usually last about an hour, the presentation, but the Q&As go on. I've had them go on for about almost 3 hours, and I've had to cut them off because there's just so much discussion around what this means for the community, and that's absolutely brilliant. That's exactly what we're aiming for. Just to talk you a little bit through how we sort of step through this narrative, essentially, it's got 3 parts to it, and some of you might be familiar with the 3-act narrative or a story arc format in terms of telling a story. So that's essentially what we've done with the AF8 scenario, which is quite a complex scientific report, but we've broken that down into sort of 3 parts, digestible parts for this piece of communication. So rather than throw a big heavy event at everybody, we're sort of breaking it down into pieces that can be easily understood and put together, rather than put in the too hard basket. So we start with really, what is the Alpine Fault? Where do we live? And this is really around setting the scene for that talk. We then sort of look at what an AF8 event would be like, and that if you're familiar with that story arc, 3-act structure, that's the complication or the disruption that we might be looking to experience. And then we finish with that resolution or result, which really goes around, well, how can we be prepared? And so we're sort of looking at that kind of arc throughout each presentation. So we apply that both in our public talks. So there is our science lead, Associate Professor Caroline Orchiston, presenting in Waimate. They have a lovely, I tell you what, some of these rural communities have some of the best venues. This is the movie theatre in Waimate, where we had about 140 people turn up to our first talk this year, which was brilliant. And down in the lower part there, that is me at Wakatipu High School a couple of years ago. Rather than a PowerPoint presentation, we've got a big 3D, which we've got 2 of them now, 2 big 3D machine model maps where I've built a projector across the top, and I can project down the scenario information. I can project down animations about how the Alpine Fault moves. It creates a bit more of a tactile engagement for young people. We put Monopoly houses on where we are, where other people are that we know of, and I use cardboard arrows to show some of that movement as well. And it becomes a bit of a discussion point and a feature for the ongoing narrative throughout the session. And this is what some of that engagement looks like. So these are all taken from the most recent roadshow, where we have really good engagement across the island. Down there in the bottom left corner there, that is Kokatahi, or Kokatai as the locals call it, up the back of Hokitika, which is a very small rural community. I think we set up the start of that talk with about 50 seats and ended up with about 170 people turning up, which was fantastic, of all ages. We also tailor our talks. So we have, like I said, we have really great support from our science community. So we invite scientists along who might have some local knowledge. So down there in the bottom right there is Professor Tom Wilson from the University of Canterbury, presenting in his hometown of Methven with his old geography teacher and dad in the audience. And people who are really able there to personalise some of these effects, rather than bringing that science down to that local level and helping people engage with it in a conversational way, rather than this is what you need to know kind of way, go and do with it with what you like. In the school sessions, very much a similar aspect. So like I said, there's another shot of that map. We also use one of the Quake Core shaky tables with my colleague Brandy Alger and to demonstrate different terminology like magnitude and intensity. So we're trying to build some risk literacy here as well, so people actually can use the terms as part of that conversation we're trying to build. And just there in the middle top is 2 cards from a game I play with the students. So rather than sending them away with a list of preparedness actions they should be doing or what they need to tell their mum and dad to do or guardians to do, we get them to play a game where essentially it's designed so they have multiple conversations with their own peer group around what they could do as priority actions to be prepared for events like an alpine fault earthquake. Involves a lot of movement and activity, so it's quite a good one to end on as well, rather than a lot of thinking. So that's, and the idea is they leave not only knowing what the alpine fault is and what it can do, but also what they can do about it, and then having lots of conversations with their own peer group, as I said.
Okay, Alice, if you can just wrap up now.
Yep, sure. So there's a few stats, and just to finish on that last slide there, probably one of the best feedbacks I've ever had is that middle quote there from a student who came back into the room after we were packing up. She looked absolutely petrified to even express herself, but she told me she was really scared of earthquakes, but now that she understood them and what she could do about them, she felt much better and thanked me for coming. So I think that's what it's all about. When we understand our landscape a bit better and what we can do about it, that scary science starts to be a little bit more manageable for us all. Apologies for going over time a little bit.
Ngā mihi, Alice, it's a really interesting talk, and the interactivity of the projection is really, I really thought that was really good fun and really great. Next up, we have Charlotte Šunde, who will be presenting on weaving lake knowledges through digital storytelling. So Charlotte, if you're able to share your screen, your slide, or I have your slide if needs be.
Yeah, maybe you just put it up.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's just fun.
I'll share it now.
I don't need to talk, I don't think.
Cool. You should all be able to, sorry.
Oh, kia ora koutou. Yeah, a good segue from the last speaker where she was talking about understanding landscape, and that's really been the focus of my work and the work that I want to present today. And I was just thinking in preparation for today's talk, I was thinking about the motivations that I've had since a child to get into the type of work that I do now, which is I'm a social science scientist in a mostly biophysical science institute, the Cawthorne Institute of Nelson. But my work has always been interested in cultural connections and values and understanding of place. And, you know, I trained in environmental planning in that regard, but then in cross-cultural communication with the sciences and the scientific worldview, which is our mainstream worldview, I suppose we'd say in New Zealand. And it just took me back to, you know, some of the family, you know, car trips we would take where my parents would stop at road cuttings, and we would get out and Dad would explain the different layers there, the different sedimentary layers and the influences of, you know, like the various volcanoes and earthquakes, as our last speaker was talking about, and, you know, particularly there in the North Island, the very evident layer of the pumice layer from Taupo. So it was that sense that, you know, right underneath our feet there we've got a very dynamic land, and it's always changing. It always has, and it always will. And so the landscape is much more than what we see on the surface, but there's this great discovery that's sort of usually kind of invisible to people unless you have some of the tools to look at it. And then as I've gone, you know, had other experiences in life, I've really come to appreciate and search out other stories of landscape and place, and those being, you know, in here in New Zealand, in particular Māori histories of place, 800 years, and not just where things are at today. You might look at a hill and see that it's mostly farmed, but you can see the traces of terraces, or you can see middens, or you can begin to envisage what things were like before our 97% of our wetlands were drained, and the way that water flowed and moved, and that dictated resources, but settlement and alliances and all the rest of it. So I think it's a really powerful combination, is bringing together this kind of knowledge, the sort of the depth of the geological, geomorphological histories of places, but also the stories. And often those stories have been inaccessible or rendered invisible unless you have grown up with them, unless you have been on to marae, or unless you have sat in and really listened at the Waitangi Tribunal claims, for example. So that's been one of the key motivations in a piece of work that I've been involved in the last 4 or 5 years, and that was one of the MB funded Endeavour projects. So they give you, you know, you do have 5 years, which is a really good opportunity to form healthy relationships with communities, and then to build on it, and hopefully to leave a legacy that, and that's been the motivation, a legacy for the communities that also give you so much of their knowledge and connections. So just in a nutshell, the Lakes 380 project is a nationwide project looking at about 10% of New Zealand's lakes, and the key tools there have been taking sediment cores from lakes and then putting them through complex machinery, detecting the eDNA and pollen and all the rest of it, and then they can build up stories of change, environmental change over time, from pre-human Polynesian influences and then into European. So you can start to read the biophysical changes. But alongside that, we've had iwi partners, and they have included the Wairarapa, around Wairarapa Moana. That's and so I've been that's been a key part of my role on the Lakes 380, has been connecting with our iwi partners. And I came out of a projects or various projects where I was working on Mātauranga Māori research and writing up wānanga and interviews and hiring field work in reports. And in a particular way, they were then protected under Mātauranga IP, so they weren't accessible to a lot of people. And so motivation in this work in doing storytelling was how to make stories accessible to people and accessible to whānau, and to whānau who don't live around the Wairarapa anymore. And so you can, I'm only showing one slide today because we have a website of stories that has something like 17 documentaries and growing, 9 audio stories, and then a little insight piece for each of these storytellers that you see presented on this slide. So I wasn't going to do justice in 8 minutes to show you a small clip, but I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go and have a poke around the website and yeah, take your time. I'm a little bit different to the slow media. I'm a slow media person. I have we've been involved in interviews that that take time and take active listening and a sense of bearing witness to the stories that our local people have shared with us. And to me, it's therefore about a revealing of those stories. And my role and the work that I've done with the videographer has been curating those narratives in ways that are authentic to the way that they were gifted to us. So in a sense, that can follow, doesn't always follow an obvious narrative arc. What was it? The setting the scene, you know, examining the problem and then coming up with solutions, because that's that's not always been the way that the history has worked in these places. And sometimes the history is, and often the history is ever present in the very moment. The pain is still there, the mamai is still there from colonization events and changes that have been that our storytellers have told us just in their short lifetimes. The changes from Lake Wairarapa, that was bountiful in all the and all the kai that was offered through to, you know, the massive changes in pollution that, people have seen and witnessed today. So in a nutshell, because everything has gone incredibly fast, I really just wanted to say that like a lake, this collection of stories we've tried to do here, like a still lake, is a form of reflecting those and reflecting those who are the closest to the lake. And one of the community members said to us that the experience you guys is having is enabling us to see a perspective of ourselves that we might not see enough of, one that we are all in this together. And so the hope with these kind of stories is that they last a lot longer than social media channels are in existence, and that in fact it's a gifting to future generations. Thank you.
Ngā mihi, Charlotte. Thank you for a really interesting talk. Ngā mihi maua kia koto moto koto korero. Thank you all of the 4 speakers for some really, really fascinating talks, and it's been really interesting how, you know, moving from your what could be seen as kind of a dry science, whether it's metrology, not meteorology, you know, how journalists are understanding science, through to earthquakes and kind of some of the fear around the earthquakes, and then through lakes, you know, and our relationships with the lakes. And so it's been really interesting to hear from that. So we have some time for some questions, some partai. I think how we'll do this, we'll do one question per speaker. I just need to close that PowerPoint so I can see everyone's questions. Sorry. Sorry. I don't know why that's not going, so apologies. I will pull it up now. So the first question is for Fung. One of the questions is, how do you want people to understand the difference between the kilogram in different places? So why does it need to be different in different places? So that's from Caredwin.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it's actually not much difference. Yeah. So why? So firstly, is why it needs to be in different places because of a dissemination issue. So we have this. There's a problem with the artifact base. A kilogram, that is so how we define it is that artifact in Paris. So if we can use that lump of metal and then distribute, I mean just circulate it around the world to calibrate all the balances, then there won't be any other kilograms. So the fact it's a dissemination issue. And of course, once you have all these standard weights, yeah, it depends on how people handle it. Yeah, if it can get lost, or you can even scrap a few grams of it, and that kind of things. Yeah, that makes it different in other places, and that makes the redefinition of the kilogram in terms of a fundamental constant. It makes more sense now, just because now that you have this constant that is the same in everywhere in the world, or even in the universe, the Planck's constant. Yeah, so now you can just build that machine, and then you can have your kilogram without, and it won't be any different to anywhere else. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. That's kind of addresses that question around the kind of different locations for the different kilograms. Yeah, and kind of understanding it.
Yeah.
We will move on now to a question for Alex. It's from Sophia Sang. Thanks, Alex. She says, I was wondering if there was any sort of comment about or recognition that press briefings are much more commonly being recorded and broadcast directly to the public, and how that would change their process.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you to all the questions. I read them all in the chat, and they'll all inform my research going forward. So if I don't have a time to answer all of them, just want to let you know that thank you, and that I'm gonna think about them all. In response to whether the broadcasting and the briefings is going to change the way journalists do their job, it's probably a little bit too early to say anything too definitive. The journalists generally talked about how this was anything but business as usual. This was extraordinary circumstance. There was an unprecedented level of interest in virology, politics, their job. And so, you know, they were looking forward to going back to something normal, and that's never really happened. But at some point, they're expecting that to happen. Not really sure if it's going to change their process. Some reporters hated the fact that they had to think about what's the public going to think about when I'm asking this question. Is this going to come across as a silly question? Some didn't mind it. Some said it's part of the job. You know, the only occupation that's more disliked than journalists are politicians. That's what they said. And then when I asked about, you know, is this the new normal? I think the response was, there'll always be a need for journalists to make sense of the news. So even if we get more raw news or straight from the press conference, journalists think that you're always going to need some kind of expert to help them make sense of that. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great, thank you. Next up, we'll have a question for Alice. This was actually one that I asked, which was, you talked about the kind of the return periods, the 300 years, the 1 in 300, or something that happened in the last 300 years. Lots of people misunderstand what that actually means. So have you found any particular tricks as a way to frame that in a more understandable or accessible way? Or like how you've managed that?
Yeah, and I suppose particularly in the school settings, it's around what that terminology means and breaking that down for people. We probably do it more successfully in the schools. In the public talks in both the schools, actually, we start with a bigger time frame of around about 20 million years of movement along that fault to move 2 red hills apart. There's one red hill at either end on either side of the fault, and there's a bit of an animation that goes with that, talks about that time frame. The research paper that the 300-year return time is based on provides the basis for most of that return time messaging, and we've broken that into graphical elements that help illustrate the evidence that leads us to understand that 300-year time frame. It does come with a 140-year to 500-year range, so that is also included in the messaging as well. In the school sessions, we've actually made that research paper into a worksheet that we work through as a group in those school sessions using calculators, and I'm very careful to say this is how the scientists do it too. They use calculators. So yeah, that tends to resonate with people, and I tend to call it a return time rather than a recurrence interval, because return is the idea of coming back, so people understand that a bit more as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Alice. And then we have a question for Charlotte here. Hi, Charlotte. This is from Laura. She says, were there any reservations from communities about sharing the stories and who owns their stories at first? You know, how did you overcome some of the reservations around the sharing of those stories?
Yeah, I'll thank you for the question. Yeah, so it's been a slow and process and of building up you know, a whakawhanaungatanga, really getting those relationships. But it's also this piece of work has been in connection with Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa and Rangatane or Wairarapa. So their environment managers have been, you know, foremost sort of guiding some of those relationships for us. We have obviously we have our ethics application set up and an ethics process, and as part of that a kind of a sense of, you know, protection of mātauranga as well. But it's really also been that part of our consent has been that we haven't released any material without the interviewer viewing it first and giving approval for that. And I think that's been a really key way of ensuring that there is comfort in what goes out, or at least how things are and how things have been portrayed. And once they've seen the videos and especially the feedback has been commenting on the tone of those how we've pulled the stories together, there's been a real sense and desire to want to be part and have more of their whānau recorded. So I haven't had any reservations in that sense. It's been more that when we're in our post-production stage, we've just ensured that that first and foremost it's respect for the interviewee and how they're presented, and perhaps some of the some things that might have you know, little comments that go that might influence, you know, have an impact on another person in the community. We haven't, you know, they haven't been the sort of stuff that we have picked up on or sensationalized or whatever. So where they're not relevant, we haven't included them. So I think the short answer to your question and my rather rambling response has been that it's been you know, we've been greeted with I would say with open arms in some ways, but we did have to go through various practices, and that was, you know, for example, we, you know, the videographer and I were what was called a kārere. We were like the advanced team or the messengers, and so we had a pōhiri on a weekend, just the two of us going on to the marae with a kai kōrero and a kai kāranga, but we were there after a pōhiri, kai, a mihi, and then we conducted an interview within the wharenui. That was a 7-8 hour day, and the range of and the emotional kind of outpouring that came from that, you know, is something that we feel a great sense of being entrusted with those sorts of stories. And I don't think that that would be shared with us if the rapport or if the interviewee, I suppose, didn't feel our ahua or our wairua was something that they could trust us with. So yeah, I think someone's just asked me if I could speak te reo, and I've done te reo classes, and I certainly I can mihi, pepeha, etc. And I have a good working knowledge, I guess, of te reo Māori. I'm not fluent, but enough for people to know that I have a sense of understanding, I guess, of aspects of te ao Māori. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time to do the rest of the questions. I just wanted to quickly reflect on some comments, because, you know, the people had sent through comments really appreciating all the speakers' work. Fung people mentioned about the great presentations and the graphics, and just were like really impressed with, you know, making something that's quite mundane just so interesting and engaging. So, you know, great job there. It's a lot to learn from you around that. Alex, people really, you know, they really value that important piece of research. We're kind of going through a change in history, and, you know, in terms of how we access that communication from the government, which includes, you know, scientific information as well. And so that, you know, that process is really changing. And Alice, you know, people were just really impressed with the audiences and the audience engagement, and just how many people were there, and just, you know, just how much people are really engaging with this, what used to be something really is quite scary, but we kind of are turning it into something we can do something about, rather than just put it, you know, try to ignore as such. Lastly, Charlotte, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear your journey about building those relationships, and for people to share their stories. People said that it was really exciting, and loves hearing about the multiple layers of peoples and landscapes and all the different types of stories. That it was a very inspiring talk. So thank you all. There were a number of questions we couldn't answer, and so at the end of the conference we'll be asking the speakers if they're happy to share their contact details on the website, and if they are, you can follow up with any burning questions that you may still have with the various speakers. I will close us off now just to say ngā mihi nui kia koutou to you all. So thank you all for attending our session. Ngā mihi mai oha to the Centre for Science Communication of Otago, University of Otago, because they've helped facilitate our Zoom. So we've been very grateful for that. Ka nui tēnei, so that's all for now. Join us on Monday at 12:30, where we have a very exciting panel being organised by the Science Media Centre. You can read all about it on the website. And the panel is on COVID-19 community-led communication. So it's led by the Science Media Centre, with 4 speakers, including Vicky Makatu, Dr. Rāmere McRae-Jansen, Dr. Michelle Dickinson, and Dr. Philip Wilcox. And that looks like a really exciting session. So I will close the session for now. Mā te wā and kia pai tō rā.